This week, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the U.S. Congress and held high-level meetings.
For the forces of civilization to triumph, America and Israel must stand together.
The visit comes as humanitarian conditions continue to deteriorate in Gaza.
We've already seen more than 990,000 people in Gaza out of 2.2 million.
And what's next in U.S. politics following President Joe Biden's withdrawal from the 2024 election? Join us on The Voice of America as we explore the issues in the news. Hello, I'm Steve Miller, in for Lori London. Now, to begin with, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed a divided U.S. Congress on Wednesday, with many Democratic lawmakers boycotting his speech and protesters gathering near the U.S. Capitol. But congressional Republicans said that the speech was key to reaffirming the U.S. commitment to its Middle Eastern ally as Israel continues its 10-month-old war with Hamas. VOA congressional correspondent Catherine Gibson kicks things off.
For the first time since the October 7th Hamas attack that left 1,200 Israelis dead and some 240 hostages captured, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressed U.S. lawmakers in person Wednesday.
It's a clash between those who glorify death and those who sanctify life. For the forces of civilization to triumph, America and Israel must stand together.
Calling anti-Semitism the world's oldest hatred, Netanyahu spoke directly to protesters.
When the tyrants of Tehran, who hang gays from cranes and murder women for not covering their hair, are praising, promoting, and funding you, you have officially become Iran's useful idiots.
Gaza's health ministry, which does not distinguish civilians from combatants, says more than 39,000 Palestinians have died since the beginning of hostilities. Netanyahu addressed the International Criminal Court's allegations of Israeli war crimes.
Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has shamefully accused Israel of deliberately starving the people of Gaza. This is utter, complete nonsense.
Several high-profile Democrats, including Vice President Kamala Harris and former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, did not attend the speech. Senator Jack Reed, who serves on the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, explained his reasons for boycotting on Tuesday.
Netanyahu's made common cause with far-right extremists who pursue their own agendas at the expense of Israel's security. These extremists have been elevated to some of the highest cabinet positions in the government and have encouraged Netanyahu's most misguided policies.
Netanyahu was welcomed by congressional Democratic and Republican leadership Wednesday. Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson.
This is a very important time. Our bipartisan congressional leadership recognized it as such and invited him here because our dear ally Israel is in an existential fight for its very existence, and that fight extends to every one of its borders.
Some families of Israeli hostages protested the speech, calling on Netanyahu to agree to a U.S. proposed ceasefire. He outlined his own vision for a post-war Middle East.
The day after we defeat Hamas, a new Gaza can emerge. My vision for that day is of a demilitarized and de-radicalized Gaza. Israel does not seek to resettle Gaza, but for the foreseeable future, we must retain overriding security control there.
Netanyahu's address is key to maintaining U.S. support for Israel, but comes at a time when domestic American politics is taking center stage. Catherine Gibson, VOA News.
VOA Flashpoint Global Crises host Steve Karesh speaks with Avi Melamed, an author and former Israeli intelligence officer and negotiator, for a deeper look at how Netanyahu's message was received at home.
I don't think highly of that speech. I think it was mostly a speech that was aiming to Netanyahu political base.
An American political base or an Israeli political base?
Particularly Israeli political base.
Well, how so?
Because he basically went through the whole cliches. It was like some sort of like a home run in context of like, at least talking to the Republicans. It's kind of like preaching to the choir in that regards. So there was nothing new in his speech. It was very clear that he's going to use all these cliches. I know that people were expecting to hear something from Netanyahu other than emotionally squeezing moments or, narratives and cliches that we are all familiar with. But, waiting to hear some sort of like a more, I would say, productive thoughts about the day after or the path ahead or things like that. But it was absent in this speech. So for me, I must say I wasn't really surprised. I didn't expect that. And I think it's a shame because it could have been an opportunity to reset a more, I would say, positive trajectory, but I don't think that Netanyahu was planning to do that anyhow.
You've served in the past as an advisor for Arab affairs. You've been a negotiator during the intifadas. What do you think the Arab audience took home from this speech?
Well, I was going quite briefly over reactions in the Arab world to the speech. As you could imagine, the very common response is that Netanyahu actually is intending to continue the war in Gaza. The other thing that comes across, again, it's not surprising, it's been there all the time, is that as far as from the Arab perspective, at least some of the commentators, once again, they indicate that, Israel is dependent upon the United States, and it's the United States support that enables Israel to continue the war in Gaza. So in that regard, to the best of my reading, the initial reactions from the Arab world, there is nothing significantly to indicate, other, of course, than the fact that, generally speaking, as you can understand and probably know, in the Arab world, there is a lot of criticism on Biden's administration, arguing that administration actually enabled Israel to continue make real efforts to stop it. Once again, one can challenge that narrative, but that narrative is definitely out there in our discussion.
Avi Melamed is an author and former Israeli intelligence officer and negotiator. He was speaking to my colleague, Steve Karesh. Now, the address to the U.S. Congress wasn't the only stop for Netanyahu in Washington. On Thursday at the White House, Netanyahu reflected on his relationship with President Joe Biden.
Mr. President, we've known each other for 40 years, and you've known every Israeli prime minister for 50 years, from Golda Meir. So from a proud Jewish Zionist to a proud Irish-American Zionist, I want to thank you for 50 years of public service and 50 years of support for the State of Israel. And I look forward to discussing with you today and working with you in the months ahead on the great issues before us.
And later that same day, he met with Vice President Kamala Harris. Now, she described her meeting with the Prime Minister as frank and constructive, while she did repeat multiple times that Israel had a right to defend itself.
I also expressed with the Prime Minister my serious concern about the scale of human suffering in Gaza, including the death of far too many innocent civilians. And I made clear my serious concern about the dire humanitarian situation there, with over 2 million people facing high levels of food insecurity, and 500,000 people facing catastrophic levels of acute food insecurity.
The vice president's firm and serious remarks suggest a possible shift in approach from President Biden regarding dealings with Netanyahu. And finally, on Friday, Netanyahu traveled to Florida for a meeting with former President Donald Trump, who is also the 2024 Republican nominee for the office. A readout of their meeting was not made available prior to our recording deadline. However, in an interview with Fox News on Thursday, Trump called for a quick end to Israel's war with Hamas and a return of the hostages, adding that Israel must better manage its, quote, public relations, end quote. For deeper analysis on Netanyahu's visit in the U.S., VOA's Scott Walterman talked with Professor Michael Provence, who teaches modern Middle East history focusing on the 20th century at the University of California, San Diego.
So what do you think Netanyahu hoped to accomplish when he came here?
Probably he didn't exactly know what he thought he was going to get out of it. Because he's been around in American politics for, getting close to 30 years. He has a very, very well-tuned sense of self-regard and a feeling that he can manipulate American politics and American politicians. He's boasted about this for years, that he can move America. This is more or less a direct quote. So he, convinced himself probably that he was going to be able to come there, get Donald Trump elected, and defeat his critics at home and do all kinds of miraculous things. And he accomplished none of that.
Do you think he was dismissive and callous towards the civilians in Gaza?
The chilling thing, I would say, is this discussion of civilization versus barbarism, which, if it's February of 2003 and the Bush administration is trying to sell a catastrophic, devastating war against Iraq, you might be able to make that kind of argument. But after ordering his army to lay waste to Gaza, the civilization versus barbarism is it's unbelievable. And to define the victims of his policies as barbarians is also breathtaking, racist, and offensive on so many levels. Nancy Pelosi said it was the worst speech that any foreign leader had ever given that she'd heard.
There were people in the chamber who was with him, though.
They are American politicians after all, so they're not facing the Israeli electorate.
There's a lot of people that say that he has damaged Israel globally in terms of its reputation. Do you agree with that?
I remember in the 90s, he was elected in 1995 or 96, I think. And Clinton was in office. Clinton was trying to get the Oslo Accords and a two-state solution through. And he was elected with the express purpose and on the platform of opposing, destroying, and eliminating the possibility of a two-state solution. But what he's done is to deliver the cause of Israel a partisan issue. And so Democrats who support Israel are going to be on the ropes, and Republicans, who are skeptical. He has fully associated support for Israel with the right.
The University of California, San Diego's Michael Provence speaking to International Edition host Scott Walterman. You're listening to Issues in the News. I'm Steve Miller. Now, ahead of Netanyahu's visit, the British NGO Oxfam also released a stark new report entitled Water War Crimes. VOA's Laurie London spoke with Scott Paul, Oxfam America Associate Director of Peace and Security, about their findings, which came out on the heels of the World Health Organization expressing deep concern about a polio outbreak in Gaza after traces of the virus turned up in sewage samples.
What we found is the water system has been brought to its knees. It's been systematically destroyed and attacked from all sides. To give you just a sense of what that looks like, in Israel, people have more than 250 liters of water per day. Before October 7th, people in Gaza had less than 90 liters of water per day, which is less than the World Health Organization says is appropriate. Today in Gaza, people have less than 5 liters of water, and that's for drinking, it's for washing clothes, it's for washing dishes, it's for cooking, and it's for bathing. To make that real, that's less than a single toilet flush of water for all of those needs for a day. And when you put that together with an environment where the wastewater treatment capabilities in Gaza have also been destroyed and undercut, you're looking at a recipe for epidemics. And we've already seen more than 900 and 90,000 people in Gaza out of 2.2 million contract acute respiratory infections. These are life-threatening diseases that are hugely avoidable and which are now running rampant across the Gaza Strip.
What specifically does the report say about how this came to be to this dire level?
It's a combination of factors, but it all comes back to Israeli policy decisions and military activities. So on October 9th, Prime Minister Gallant announced a total siege and stopped the supply of water through the Mekahot lines from Israel to Gaza. Second, it cut off electricity, and that had a huge effect on the ability of water wells to pump water, to treat water, to desalinate water. And so then you have the bombardment. And one of the things that we found is that about 88% of Gaza City's water wells have been destroyed, 100% of its desalination plants damaged or destroyed, and similar levels, not quite as high, but similar levels of destruction across the Gaza Strip. It's been a devastating systemic destruction of the water production capacity and the wastewater treatment capacity in Gaza. And then you have restrictions on humanitarian organizations like Oxfam and our ability to respond to that crisis. So for one thing, our own warehouses and our own facilities have been destroyed, and that of our partners too in Gaza. But separately from that, we've been prevented from bringing in mobile desalination units. We've been prevented from bringing in the kinds of pipes and fittings and equipment that we need to repair the water lines. And then the offices that house both the technical documents that outline how to repair these water systems, but also the material needed to do those repairs, including extra stores of fuel and extra pipes. So those offices have been destroyed. And so, there's really not one factor that is responsible for this crisis. It's this confluence of Israeli policies and military actions that have destroyed the water system and resulted in this hotbed for epidemics.
And the World Health Organization has said they are extremely concerned about polio in Gaza after the virus turned up in 6 out of 7 sewage samples in the territory.
Polio is sort of like the equivalent of famine for waterborne disease, as famine is for food security and hunger, and that these are phenomena that have no place in the modern era. It takes a lot of indifference, and in the case of polio, a lot of effort to create the kind of conditions that these phenomena can be prevalent and can emerge. And they're also alike in the sense that by the time you see one of these, by the time you see famine, and by the time you see polio, people are already dying at a shocking level, related conditions. And mind you, by the way, Gaza had a 95% vaccination rate in 2022. This is not a place where the healthcare system had not permeated. But the combination of the destruction of sanitation infrastructure and the inability to provide new vaccines has now brought us to this place where the spread of polio is now very likely. And this is not going to be contained by borders. We're talking about a highly contagious disease. And I understand that the Israeli military is vaccinating its soldiers, which will provide a layer of protection, but this is going to be a regional threat if it emerges.
That's Oxfam America Associate Director of Peace and Security, Scott Paul, speaking to our own Lori London. And finally, U.S. President Joe Biden on Wednesday explained in an Oval Office address his decision to drop his bid for re-election and to throw his support behind Vice President Kamala Harris.
History is in your hands. The power is in your hands. The idea of America lies in your hands.
Now, to get a better perspective on the U.S. presidential race following that announcement, I spoke with Craig Albert, political science professor at Augusta University. Craig, I guess where I want to start off is, what's your reaction to President Biden's Wednesday night address?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think it was a remarkable speech because you could hear his, a different tone of being sad that he did not want to drop out of the re-election campaign, but knew that this was something that, in his mind, for the sake of democracy, in order to beat former President Trump, this is what was needed. And so it was like watching somebody very reluctantly do what in their mind thought was the right thing to do. So it looks like, if you just watch it in his body language, that it hurt him to go through this process, but that he realized, his team realized that in the state that he was in, at least at the last debate, if that happened again, that there was no chance he was going to beat former President Trump. And so there was this realization that it was time to, as they say, pass the torch to somebody else, to a new generation. I think he was quoting something JFK had said before. And And that was his time. That was his mindset. So it's pretty remarkable to see a sitting president that has a term left to officially drop out of contention.
You know, one of the things I want to talk about is the fact that he did drop out, because if we turn back the hands of time to January, to the New Hampshire primary, Nikki Haley, who lost that primary to Trump, came out on stage and made this comment.
Most Americans do not want a rematch between Biden and Trump. The first party to retire its 80-year-old candidate is going to be the party that wins this election.
Haley has since fully endorsed Trump at the Republican National Convention. But Craig, do her comments still hold water?
Well, in January, I believe, is when she said that.
Right.
Yes, absolutely. I think then there was something to be said. And then a couple of events happened since then, though, Steve, that I'm not necessarily sure that holds true. And I'm speaking of the Republicans, of course. So in January, the Republican Party was still pretty divided, still pretty divisive among themselves concerning if they were going to elect Trump. There was a lot of mainstream Republicans who are still anti-Trump, anti-MAGA crowd. Since the attempted assassination, though, you see a rallying around the flag towards former President Trump, where his polling is much higher. So I think Nikki Haley had a point in January that whoever dropped out first and brought in a newer generation at the time was absolutely correct. On the Democratic side, I also agree it's time for a new generation, of course. I mean, we've seen the ages of the presidents keep creeping up since former President Trump first ran in 2016. And so this is something that has concerned a lot of voters on both sides. I think 80% of people, regardless of party, thought President Biden and President Trump are too old.
With so many Americans already decided who they're going to vote for, whether it be the candidate or the party, is there still time to really get into and sway independent voters, or is this really all about the swing states who have typically made the president in the last few elections?
That's a great question. I think it's who's going to be able to get the voters to turn out. I think right now there's more voter enthusiasm behind President Trump and Republicans, former President Trump and Republicans, than there is for the Democrats and Vice President Harris right now. Of course, there was when it fluctuated from Biden to officially or unofficially, presumptively Harris, those numbers rose again back towards the Democrats a little bit. So Trump lost some percentage points among the independent group. But who's going to turn out more? There's a feeling that there are, on the extreme left, there might be some people that are upset at how the primary process played out for President Biden in the first place, and they might choose not to show up. The Democrats need everybody in each of these states to show up to make sure that they win an election. We're thinking about Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, and Georgia. So they need all of their base to show up. They need to pick up the college-age crowd, almost in an election like you saw for President Obama in his first. You need everybody that typically doesn't vote, but that is more liberal or more progressive to show up, I think, in order for Vice President Harris to beat former President Trump at this moment. Because I think the Republicans now, and I think amongst them, you'll see that rallying around Trump stay through the election. I think they're going to come out, and they're going to come out in high numbers, which I don't think was the case in 2020 for President Trump. So I think you'll see that on the right side of the aisle, but what we will see on the left side, and how will that affect the independent as well? Who's going to motivate them the most? So I think Vice President Harris at this point has more time to make a move and make a case than does President Trump for those undecided or uncommitted voters in the middle.
Craig Albert is a political science professor at Augusta University in Georgia. Craig, as always, thank you for your time and your insight.
Thank you very much, Steve.
And while the Democratic Party delegates have pledged support to Harris to become the party's presidential nominee, they're still free to vote for anyone. State Department spokesperson Matthew Miller advised adversaries not to view America's political process as a sign of weakness.
They at all are thinking of taking advantage of the upcoming political transition in the United States, which is still 6 months away. They should think again.
And with that, that's all the time we have this week. On behalf of everyone here at VOA, I'd like to thank you for joining us. But for more news throughout the week, be sure you listen to International Edition Monday through Friday, or visit us anytime at voanews.com. Join us next week for more issues in the news. And until then, I'm Steve Miller.